sustainability. And in our colloquium series, we bring in fabulous people doing fabulous things, and no more fabulous than Damien White. I've known Damien for a long time, and he's a sociologist, political theorist, with teaching and research interests in the sociology of design, architecture, adaptive reuse, urban and environmental sociology, and he's got a particular interest in urban political ecology. He does historical and political sociology studies, he looks into critical theory, and he's into urban studies and photography as well. He's got a first-class honours degree from the University of Kiel in the UK in political science and American studies. He's got a master's in political sociology and political theory, and he did his PhD in sociology at the University of Essex. I particularly noted that next semester he's teaching a class called Designing Post-Carbon Futures, Political Ecologies of Hope, Solidarity and Possibility. Damien, I'm coming to your class, mate, all right? And today he's going to talk to us about Labour-centred eco-design. Should the Green New Deal champion a design politics for Labour, a design politics by Labour, or a design politics with Labour? Or, Damien, all the above.
All the above.
All the above. Damien, thanks, and looking forward to your talk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julian. So, folks, can you see my screens there? Am I sharing? Wonderful. Thanks very much. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much, Julian, for inviting me. Just to say, I'm deeply in debt to Julian for many reasons. Just a little anecdote. Many, many years ago, when I was first applying for jobs out of PhD world, I got a job interview in the United States, and the only professor I knew, the proper adult in the United States who was British, who had a job in the United States, was Julian. So I rang him up and said, look, help me, I don't have a clue. And he coached me through the whole interview process. And it was very, very nice of him, and I got the job. So that's a nice little moment. And then a few years later, we connected. So I owe Julian all my academic activities. But today I want to talk about a few things. I want to talk about Labour-centred design for just and sustainable transitions. So that's what I've been trying to think about in the last few years. And this really comes out of a series of papers that I've written over the last 2 years or so, which have really been kind of building out of the tradition of the just transition and discussions about the just transition, and trying to connect that to design and then connect that to Labour. So in this little talk, I'll talk for about half an hour. And what I'd like to do is really firstly talk a little bit about this frame, discourse, the just transition. And I want to really kind of just give you a sense of its strengths and its limitations. Then I'd like to go on to talk about reasons why I think the just transition could fruitfully engage with the fields of eco-design, design for sustainability, more broadly eco-design studies, just environmental studies, and just sustainability studies. And so I'm interested in this broad area, and then I'd also be interested in thinking about how a just transition framework influenced by what's emerging field known as environmental labour studies might allow us to just ask some interesting questions, I hope, about design for sustainable futures. And then I want to go back to the Green New Deal and then just pose a set of questions to the Green New Deal and to discussions about the Green New Deal. So that's what I want to do today. So let's just talk about the just transition to begin with. So the just transition is a body of thinking which has a really interesting genealogy. It really emerges quite surprisingly out of the American labor movement around the early 1970s, where a range of labour unions were really trying to think about ways in which anti-toxics and emerging concerns about toxic pollution might be thought through a Labour-friendly agenda, whilst trying to avoid some of the tensions that exist between jobs versus environmentalist conflict, which was very central to the relationship between Labour and environmentalism in the 70s as environmentalism emerged in the United States, but has become an ongoing concern that environmental sustainability, post-carbon futures might impact jobs and might be ultimately detrimental to working people or built off the backs of working people. So this discussion emerges in the 1970s, and it's a current, really a subordinate current that starts to move through various attempts to construct red-green alliances between the 70s and the 90s, mostly in North America. This historical moment has fairly limited success, which I'll just talk about a little bit more in a minute. But during the late 90s, and as the Obama moment occurs, and as the first talk of a Green New Deal emerges, you start to see a kind of a resuscitation of the just transition discourse as people like Van Jones are starting to talk about a green collar economy and trying to imagine a kind of a productive green political economy which could address the moment of the financial crisis and the Great Recession of 2008. But the just transitions had an interesting kind of trajectory since this North American moment. Most notably, it started to percolate through a range of social movements more broadly. It started to be internationalized through the international labor movement predominantly, as they brought this discourse into the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the global negotiations around climate change as a discourse. And it's probably reached its high point as a kind of global discourse in the most recent climate change global meeting that occurred in Katowice in Poland, where in 2018 the whole frame of the meeting was focused around just transitions, at least. So the just transition then is a discourse that has got many parents, if you like, but Labour-focused just transitions, as I've intimated, have always had some, issues and controversies surrounding them. Most notably, those sections of the labour movement that are very much either embedded in extractive or fossil fuel economy sectors, or simply are more conservatively predisposed, have often kind of looked at the just transition and called it, to quote Richard Trumka, a fancy name for a funeral. So some sections of the labour movement have looked upon the term as fundamentally problematic. Some sections of the environmental movement have similarly looked upon the just transition as too little too late. We might say the more doomster apocalyptic view. But there's been more interesting critiques made of the just transition by people like Dimitri Stevis, who have long suggested over the last decade that there's an interesting tension emerging within international labour discussions around what actually constitutes the politics of the just transition. Is this some kind of rebate third way centrism of the Clinton-Blair era? Is it an attempt to envisage a kind of almost German style green social democratic corporatist institutional framework that can start to guide post-carbon thinking? Or is it allied with a broader project of the Green New Deal, or even more radically still, does it affirm some sort of systemic change vision, eco-socialism, etc.? So these disputes have gone on within union circles, and the just transition's been used in different ways by different groups with different kinds of politics, from the centre left to the more radical left. It's also the case that the just transition has also been, it's been observed by analysts that it's become, there's often a gap between rhetoric and reality, and that the sheer complexity of thinking through the just transition is and concrete material examples of how this can be done well are more thin on the ground than the actual discourse. So people have pointed to examples in South Africa where there have been mobilizations around just transitions, but then when the rubber has hit the road and government policy has attempted to be enacted on these premises, it's often had backsliding occur simply because of the power of the fossil fuel industry and the carbon lock-in of various economies more generally. So the concept then is contested. It's certainly diversified. It certainly ranges in its kind of politics, but at the same time, as it's diversified and as controversies have emerged around it, it has expanded more broadly, the just transition, and different social movements have taken it up as a frame, as a discourse for thinking about just and equitable forms of decarbonisation. So there's been mobilisations around gender and feminist mobilisations. Most strikingly, there's been a whole series of mobilisations around Indigenous movements and Indigenous activists who have used the just transition framework and have found that productive, as have Black activists and struggles trying to intersect between Black lives and carbon issues. So just transitions have then really unleashed a kind of an interesting range of different forces that have tried to use this concept and found this concept productive and generative, despite the fact that it certainly comes with issues and tensions. So what are, broadly speaking, some of the issues and tensions that exist in the concept? Well, clearly the concept itself, opens up further issues. So the just transition in its first framing, as I suggested, was very much directed towards workers and workers in industries that might have to effectively transition to facilitate other possibilities. So it was very much focused on fossil fuel workers, on energy sector workers, but social movement actors have filled out this discussion and said, well, what about frontline and fence line communities? How do they relate to the just transition? Don't we need a broader understanding? There's been interesting debates occurring about the relationship between just transitions and climate justice, just transitions and economic development. There's been interesting debates about the relative differences between northern and southern understandings of just transitions. There are ongoing concerns about the extent to which a social democratic settler colonial understanding of just transitions might not actually produce that kind of outcome for colonized people or indigenous peoples. And more generally, what constitutes just is an ongoing point of tension between, shall we say, climate hawks who might want to decarbonise using all the tools that we have at the moment, including nuclear or entertaining the possibilities for geoengineering, and more traditional environmentalist understandings of just transitions, which are much more focused on, say, renewable energy sources and so on. So there are certainly tensions there, but diversification, I think, what makes it interesting, I think, as a concept, is that it's really opened up the debate about how we think about decarbonisation. And I think what makes it interesting and exciting is how it's kind of expanded a range of possibilities and literatures that we can connect the question of the just transition of decarbonisation to. So there's been some really important work done by people like Alyssa Battistoni and Kate Aronoff, who have talked about the ways in which, a pure focus on kind of green collar stroke blue collar just transitions really needs to be expanded to think about the full range of work now that is done under so-called pink collar premises, the caring economy, the service economy, and the extent to which that kind of employment involved in caring, healthcare, teaching could be understood as low carbon work, which needs to be expanded. And there's also been really important critiques by these authors made of the gender blind nature of green collar discourse and the ways in which it might be reliant on or render invisible all the forms of social reproduction and work and labour, gendered labour, that is involved in maintaining our current high carbon societies and needs to transition. So obviously domestic labour, caring labour, gendered labour, etc. A range of really important Indigenous writers like Nick Estes or scholars coming from places like Tunisia, such as Match Algae, have drawn out some of the interesting and important implications about the limits of just transitions based on a kind of Northern European or North American foci that is mainly just focused on just a rollout of renewables and not addressing exploitative supply chain questions that can displace environmental bads onto southern or frontline or fence line communities in the global south, or minority communities or dispossessed communities in the global north. And that just transitions clearly can't be based or premised on offloading the environmental bads to the kind of lithium mines and coltan mines of people living in Chile or Congo or other such places. So this has been an important intersection. There's an important set of questions which I think have yet to be fully explored about how the just transition discourse in labour movements can engage with a much more long-standing discussion of urban environmental justice practices and planning, which Julian Adjeman, Bob Bullard, David Pellow, and many others have been developing alongside this tradition. So there's an interesting, much of the work of urban environmental justice anticipates, is sympathetic to, and has certainly developed a whole set of discourses, practices and interventions which essentially are profoundly complementary to just transition discussions in labour movements, but the urban moment and the labour moment have been kind of disconnected somewhat. So it's interesting, be interesting to talk about how we could connect those relationships. There's been some really important work done about the nature of green jobs, the importance of facilitating not just any kind of green job, but well-paid green jobs which are informed by a kind of rigorous anti-racist analysis that is attentive to the ways in which the environmental negatives of renewables in particular can be outsourced. And then there's, I think, one of the things that's been particularly interesting about just transition as it's diversified and hybridized is that the account of labour in this literature has become much more queered, hybrid, expanded as we've come to recognise labour as class, gendered, racialized, involving issues of ability, that labour comes in many different forms. It's formal, but it can also be informal. It's direct and material, but it also can be cognitive and emotional. So all kinds of workers involved in who are part of the multiracial and multigendered working classes are involved in multiple kinds of labour, which needs to be captured in any credible account of the just transition. So let me just kind of sum up by saying, well, what are some of the strengths of the just transition and what attracts me to this discourse? Well, one of the things that I really like about the discourse ultimately is that it's a discourse that's emerged through struggle and campaigning, not just academia. And so this is a point that's made by colleagues of ours, Eduard Moreno, Dunya Kraus and Dimitri Stevis in a new book that they've just done on the just transition, which I really like. And they talk about the just transition as a living concept, which is very much kind of rooted in the experience and frontline and working communities, frontline communities and working people's struggle. So it hasn't emerged out of academia, it's emerged somewhere else. And despite the contestations and tangles around it, it still has the capacity to connect disparate groups. So it's interesting in that respect. The other aspect of just transition, I think that is increasingly interesting, is the way in which it's created a more international discussion than possibly the Green New Deal has to date, although the Green New Deal is shifting itself, and colleagues such as Daniel Aldana Cohen and Theo Rio Francas are doing some amazing dialogue with movements in Latin America around the Green New Deal. But nevertheless, the just transition has a literature which thinks across multiple scales, from the national to the regional to the transnational. And so it's not as focused at the moment in a kind of methodological nationalist frame that most Green New Deals are. So Green New Deals are obviously mostly concerned with kind of quite pragmatic, national-based strategies for decarbonisation, very important. But there can be a certain amount of methodological nationalism there, to quote Ulrich Beck, whereas the just transition discourse flings you out into the international tensions and dialogues. So point three, for me, the attraction is that it opens up to environmental analysis, urban ecological analysis, to different stories, different narratives, different ways of making connections, which I'll try and elucidate a little more in a minute, but particularly the histories of environmental and labour struggles past and present, the dangers and the tension. So I think that's really interesting, and it's particularly interesting when these are connected to struggles around the labours of racialised labour, gendered labour, the indigenous labour. So finally, I think two final points. That it's an interesting complexifying discourse, in that much of the literature of the just transitions around just transitions kind of implicitly starts to kind of force us to acknowledge that just transitions are going to be messy, complicated, inconsistent, and possibly antagonistic at different geographical scales. So this is a point made by Dimitri Stevis, that a decarbonising project pursued at a local scale or at a city scale might have knock-on effects unintentionally that are not necessarily producing just transition for other communities or actors elsewhere. Just transitions might be marked by some level of winners and losers. There might be conflicting outcomes. And it's an imaginary that in contrast to perhaps some environmental narratives, which are very much focused on kind of consumption as and the consumption of the global north as the central problem, starts to direct our attention to production consumption networks and the importance of thinking about the way in which production and consumption are organised together, as opposed to purely focusing on consumption, which I think is possibly delimiting. And so in this respect, in kinds of broader environmental discussions, I think what attracts me to it as well is that at the moment in our kind of decarbonising debates, we're often kind of presented with a very kind of binary and singular set of debates, which present to us, either degrowth or eco-modernisation as the only singular ways of moving forward. And whilst both of these literatures, I think, have real insights and have accomplished a great deal, it seems to me that what just transitions firmly bring into focus is the issue of combined and uneven development that exists both within the global north and south, and between and within the global north and global south. And so this requires us to think in more geographical ways about the extent to which decarbonisation is going to involve, at some level, growing of certain sectors, degrowth of others, recomposition of others. And this is a messy, complex debate which may well ultimately require a kind of shrinking of material throughput to facilitate decarbonisation, but needs a language that is complex enough to map the very different typologies of how that is going to occur. And sometimes I think we fall into a very simplistic dialogue about growth or degrowth in these eco-mod degrowth arguments, and we don't map the trajectories of composition and recomposition that needs to occur. So these are some of the virtues of the just transition, but there are some certain limits to the discourse, to be sure. Most notably, it can be still quite carbon centric and energy reductionist. It's not entirely clear how planetary it is as discourse. It has a global frame, I've suggested, but to an extent it might be seen as predominantly circulating in a kind of Anglosphere, Spanish language sphere, possibly, but I'm not entirely sure how much it expands into the East Asian world at the moment, for example. Much of the literature can be more descriptive rather than prescriptive, interested in typological kind of activities rather than speculative. But the issue that I really want to kind of grapple with here today is the extent to which a lot of the just energy transition emerging out of political science, drawing from the just transition, is really important, really valuable, essential, but it's somewhat left the questions about the material, cultural, socio-technological and aesthetic forms of decarbonisation left really. It hasn't really engaged with this. So, you know, the argument and the pitch that I want to make to you is that clearly just transitions are in part going to involve a shift in our material culture, our infrastructure, our urban forms, our design forms. And so necessarily they are going to have to enroll design, architecture and planning in a politics of design. And so, you know, the just transition then needs to have a more expansive vocabulary. It needs to have a set of more expansive imaginaries to think about post-carbon pleasures, a hegemonic cultural materialist politics of just transitions. And it needs to think about the material economies, the material cultures, and the production consumption networks that would sustain a just transition. So that's what kind of interests me, beyond the kind of nuclear renewables. That's very important, but isn't there a whole set of other material practices which are related to this, deeply embedded in this discussion, but not necessarily reducible all to energy? So over the last couple of years, down at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, I've been trying to kind of convene a few discussions around these issues. And here you can see a beautiful set of posters that was done by my colleague Anastasia Rayner for our first symposia that we did in 2019. And then here was a later one that we did about 10 months later, just last November. And so I want to focus here now on the question of design. What does design offer for the just transition? What could it do? Now, obviously, design understood, you know, in its conventional mainstream fashion is an ideological and material facilitator of fossil capitalism, surveillance capitalism, algorithmic capitalism, Taylorism, empire, etc. So we know all this, but obviously the history of design, architecture planning is not reducible to this either. So design is not to be trusted, as I said in a recent paper, but I've really tried to emphasize in this paper that post-carbon futures are not simply going to emerge through protest and policy shifts alone. So this is my kind of bid for a kind of founding claim. Just transitions will have to be struggled for and produced through political struggle, but through this struggle, they will also have to be imagined and built, fabricated and realized, coded and created. And this is going to involve the channeling of enormous amounts of creative labor and inventive praxis. And it's also going to involve the construction of public spaces and public institutions where new knowledge practices can meet and different kinds of labor-friendly eco-designs can flourish. So what do I mean by that? That's a very kind of big fat theory statement that needs a little unpacking, I'll try to do that. So why should the fields engage more broadly? Well, I think I'm speaking to planners and designers here, so I don't think I need to underline this issue too much. But obviously, design is ubiquitous. It's a central way in which we make ourselves and the world around us. This is a nice turn by Tony Fry. We as humans are made by what we make. We design, and the things we design us. So the relationship between design studies nicely draws out the dialectical relationship between our material culture and our ongoing attempts to think politically and act politically in the world. I think it's interesting as well, if you link just transitions to design, you can get an interesting concept of how to think about sustainability. Most notably, some of the most interesting design theorists that I follow, like Cameron Tonkinwise, are constantly emphasizing the importance of thinking about the ways in which design reveals a world that needs to be made and made and made again. And Cameron Tonkinwise did a great paper down at RISD many years ago now, where he says sustainable design has to be done again and again and again. So it's not a once all fix. It's not the descent of ecotopia. It's not a singular design form, a planning form that just lands as post-carbon. It's going to be iterative and ongoing and constant, particularly as we deal with ongoing warming Earth from 1 to 2 degrees. So we're going to have an iterative understanding of design. And then design can draw our attention to the ways in which, design is interested in everyday life as a source of potential experiments for different ways of living. It might help us think about those activities, and the just transition might help us aggregate these kinds of thinking. So where can we go for this? Well, obviously there's a really important tradition of ecological design, which has done a great deal since, the Whole Earth Catalogue and the radical technology movement, to the rise of cradle-to-cradle design, closed-loop production, emotionally durable design, project drawdown, service design. All these traditions have made a huge contribution to how we can think about design for sustainability. And it's certainly the case more recently. There's been even more exciting work where people have tried to think more systemic and comprehensive still, moving beyond green design to, adaptive design, systematic retrofitting of urban areas, eliminative design, ways in which we might have to design out products, processes and services that are high carbon, prefigurative design, post-material design from objects to services. So design theory is full of interesting and important insights that can inform the Green New Deal and the search for just transitions. Design theory as well is full of kind of desires to embark on speculative futuring. So design is one part of the academy that, as skeptical postmodernism descended, it was the one part that did not give up on speculation and on the future. And it's not surprising that suddenly now a whole range of people are turning to design futuring to think about other possible futures. So eco-design, service design, transition design, there's a gamut of really important traditions now in design which are helping and trying to think about ways in which our material culture could be transformed. But one of the things that interests me, or started to interest me, about these discussions is the extent to which much of this radical design tradition really has increasingly had less and less to say about the labor of design, who's doing the designing, the labor conditions of designers, but also who is enrolled in broader sustainable design projects, and whose voice, knowledge and labor is enrolled in these multiple kinds of green design. So labor, I think, has gone missing in a lot of contemporary radical critical transition designs discussions. And I've also argued in a paper recently that I can send you that there's also significant gaps in radical critical design imaginary. There are institutional, political, economic, scalar gaps in how design has thought about change over the last 2 decades or more. So where might we go to rethink these relationships? Well, one of the things that I've been trying to do recently is really just try and argue that there are actually a whole set of traditions of design that have taken labour, the workplace, and other spaces very seriously, and have really tried to think about the relationship between design, labour, and ecological futures. Now, one such key person here, as I've written about in a recent paper, is William Morris, who wrote this really fantastic essay called A Factory as It Might Have Been. And Morris was trying to conceptualize a factory of the future, which both allowed working people the full gains of a more cooperative, sumptuous form of living, but at the same time allowed them to be actively empowered in the shaping and crafting of the production processes. So Morris is really interesting and well worth thinking about. Ebenezer Howard is really interesting in the ways in which his Garden Cities project certainly tried to think about cooperative forms of work as part of his confederal vision of the future. And then there are many other traditions that I've been trying to excavate recently, from Scandinavian traditions of worker-centered design, which erupt in the 1970s, which are trying to empower the knowledge of workers so that they can control their own technological transformations, to, I'll just skip over that, to feminist traditions of design, urban design, which represented by people like Dolores Hayden, who are trying to think about gendered labour being rendered central and invisible and visible in the forms that the city could take. This is a wonderful book, The Grand Domestic Revolution. Talks a lot about non-credentialised designers trying to think about community restaurants, co-housing, wages for housewives, communal kitchens, urban and municipal infrastructure owned by women. And then we have an eruption most recently of a whole set of scholarship that has really tried to draw attention to the extent to which the labour of Indigenous people in terms of the landscape of this country has been systematically rendered invisible, but also the ways in which stories of design history have tended particularly to focus on the great white male designer and ignore the labour, often the racialised and gendered labours of the draftsmen and women, the model makers and construction workers, who play such a central role in all kinds of design. So a kind of devaluing of the class, gendered and racialised labours of maintenance and repair conducted by all manner of design practitioners, mechanics and milliners, tailors and janitors, that are central to social and ecological production. So much of this literature then, and I'll just kind of wrap this up here, has really kind of tried to draw our attention then to the extent to which you know, a much more expansive account of design can allow us to think about how design competencies have been enacted around the 20th century by many people who were not formally understood as designers. We drew from their knowledge, often extractively, but they envisaged products that and designed schemes and designed futures which were profound and emancipatory in many respects. So here are some images in the corner here of the Black Panthers free food program, which is a really interesting example of what many people would call a kind of service design intervention, yet it was done at a scale and had an impact well beyond most contemporary service design today. So let me just wrap up then by raising questions that these kinds of interventions pose for projects like the Green New Deal at a national level and just transitions for decarbonisation at a more global level. I think the question that they kind of raise are really questions about design by whom, with what social and ecological impacts, and what modes of displacement. What kinds of labour do we want to bring into view? What kinds of ecological design, and what kinds of scales of design interventions? And essentially, I think we need to start thinking about power relations, both within design, around labour in particular, but also between labour and its design labour and the labour of publics. So I think what I'm trying to think about is a political sociology of design, which is really trying to think about how design itself is often entangled in exploitative labour relations, neoliberalised relations and market forms, which can limit its capacity to transform the world. But also diffuse design by lay publics is often undercut by all kinds of exploitative, gendered and racialized power dynamics. So radical designers can rely on a level of labor which, you know, can often be exploitative in its own way. So when we're thinking about a Green New Deal, when we're thinking about just transition, you know, how are we thinking about this and who's got voice? We can think about a design politics for labour, which would be building beautiful urban spaces for working people. But here we confront the issue of technocracy and paternalism. But then we might want to draw from traditions emphasising a design politics by labour, which wants to emphasise the multiracial and multi-gendered working class, having their capacities to design and be involved as self-authors or participants in making urban ecological and social ecological relations. But this can fall back on romanticism in particular. So how can we think about these two moments together? How can we think about a design politics for labour, for just transitions? How can we think about ways in which, you know, designers can join alliances? How can we institutionalise these alliances? What might we learn from previous moments in design and planning in particular to help us think about how just transitions and design might come together through traditions of community planning, advocacy planning, stakeholder planning? And so just to finish off then, you know, how could design for just transitions foreground racialized gender labor? How could it place it at its center? What would it mean to think about that? What would it mean to think about sustainable, just and multi-purpose infrastructures that facilitated not just human but multi-species entanglements more generally? What would it mean to foreground in the just transition a non-sexist, equitable and anti-racist green urbanism that really took on the problem of green gentrification? What would it mean in design futuring to step beyond a kind of Western-centric or Eurocentric or settler colonial gaze and take plural alternative modernities seriously? So I think I'll shut up there because I've said enough, and I'll invite your critiques and comments.
Well, Damien, thanks always. I remember the American Association of Geographers a few years ago. I just sat back in my chair and I listened to the breadth of your thinking and scholarship, and it never ceases to amaze me. Great. I'm going to take moderator prerogative here, and something I've been thinking about and goes right back to the basics. Why are we talking about a just transition? Why not a just transformation? Because I could see a transition from one unsustainable state to another unsustainable state, whereas transformation implies just, queered, gendered, you know, it implies all of those things. Why are we talking about a just transition?
Yeah, I suppose I would just say that, you know, social movements themselves generate terms that they use.
Yeah.
And I kind of run with what they're using,
yeah.
You know, and so, you know, I certainly can, and I think that within the concept transition at the moment, this is where people are in that discourse.
Yeah.
So I can certainly see your point, but to construct a dialogue with those groups, right, it helps to use their language, I suppose I'd say.
Yeah, okay. And this is one of the things that you and I, as people who sort of work in the real world, we have to be cognizant of ideas that have come up from the ground and help expand them rather than maybe criticizing the wording. But it's just, yeah, it's a very interesting thing. Okay, we've got some questions. What do you perceive to be the connection between a just transition and an abolitionist vision to deconstruct all forms of oppression and invest in community care, mutuality and reciprocity?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. That's such a great question. Well, I think that, you know, the abolitionist turn now is not only undergirdling the need to kind of recover the racialized histories of design that have been obscured by the kind of white male design history fetish, but also to think across institutional forms which, you know, perhaps have been quite delimited by the just transition. So most obviously, you know, I didn't talk about the prison in this presentation. I didn't talk about, you know, modes of surveillance in the city. I didn't talk about the ways in which other institutions, police, etc., are fundamentally used to subordinate certain groups. I think that there is a great opportunity for a much more expansive turn still through that kind of intersection. Right. So, and certainly, you know, then we could start to look at the not only the unjust implications of the prison industrial complex, but its insane carbon and other entanglements, and how much it's linked to kind of multiple forms of subordination and human misery, as well as ecological negative outcomes.
Okay. Another question, can you speak to the just transition with regard to renewable energy, both upstream and downstream, the gendered labour of e-waste versus construction?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, to be sure. I mean, there are people that are much better positioned than me to talk about that. So I would direct people to the work of Miles Lennon and Thea Rio Frances. I think that there's a really important debate going on here now about the upstream and downstream impacts of renewables. And I think that the first stage of this debate has been mapping and acknowledging those impacts. I think what interests me about Miles and Thea's work, and Dustin Mulvaney's work in this area, and Clark Miller as well out in Arizona, is that they're trying to not just acknowledge the impacts, but indicate or suggest ways in which these might be ameliorated. So, you know, we are certainly going to have a massive ramp up of renewables. This is going to have material impacts, but it's not given that they necessarily result in unjust outcomes. That really depends on the configuration of labour, the configuration of supply chains, the capacities for workers in the global north to ally with workers in the global south, the capacity of us to have just trade relations, and the capacity for us to have kind of reflexive community planning. And I think all those thinkers that I've mentioned are really trying to add that second turn to that discussion, which I think is really important.
Another question, what will it take to finally kill the workforce skills gap discourse? Is there a city you know of which is eschewing the typical business demand-driven labour supply development model? Thank you for being here. We appreciate it.
That's a great question. Thank you very much for that. You know, that's really hard for me to answer there. I would always be tempted to go to see how Denmark has been addressing these issues. I remember reading the paper, looking at that maybe 6 months ago, but to tell you the truth, it's not really my field. So I would have to defer to a better placed people than that.
Yeah, okay. And we've got another question. Design is expensive and frequently paid for by the client. I'd love to know a bit more about who pays for and commissions designs in a just transition.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. Another great question. I think, you know, this it is certainly the case under 40 years of neoliberalism in particular, that design has become progressively attached to and embedded, particularly in the United States, in a kind of private client market context. But there, I think part of the intellectual work that we need to do is really to draw out other historical models. So up until the 1980s in the UK, something like about 60 to 70% of architects worked for public bodies and public councils. And there have been other models of thinking about how design could relate to public institutions. So I think that is really the critical, issue of the moment. And I think that someone like Billy Fleming has really, tried to think about your question in probably, the most impressive way. So, Lindsay, I would really encourage you to Google an essay by Billy Fleming called Design and the Green New Deal. And he really kind of looks at, the way in which landscape architecture in particular has been massively delimited by its relationship to private clients and private market actors and real estate development, leading it, he argues, to be a kind of prettification discourse, whereas it's got this vast, ambitious history of landscape transformation. And, part of his argument for the Green New Deal is really to say that the state could be enacted through a Green New Deal to employ designers for the public good, as it did through the Civilian Conservation Corps and the WPA and the other agencies of the first New Deal. So he's very much got a kind of argument that says design could put people back to work, and it could create a public set of institutions that designers are focused on to decarbonize. I think that's a really important question. I think the interesting supplementary question is, how do we do that without repeating all the old problems of high modernism that sometimes followed from that?
Okay, and our last question is there anything we can learn from the European Green New Deal and its implementation of just transitions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. It's my sense at the moment that the European Green New Deal is embodied in many conflicting kinds of politics, where it's not entirely clear how much a broadly technocratic and market-driven vision of the Green New Deal will actually deliver. So it kind of throws us back to, the beginning of this talk, which was talking about how, the just transition is this contested, and some would say sometimes co-opted conversation. And so I suppose what we can learn from the European Green New Deal is that the Green New Deal is going to emerge, it will be co-opted, it will be imperfect, but we still need to find strategies to push for more democratic, more public versions of this while it's being co-opted. So similarly to, developments like the circular economy in the EU, which, at one level is highly technocratic, highly kind of institutionally limited, but at the same extent providing kind of material possibilities that could be reprogrammed, prefigured, remade in different fashions. So I think it's, the question of how do we engage in an ongoing politics that acknowledges co-optation is inevitable for Green New Deals and just transitions, but how do we fight the fight to keep public's democratic accountability and just outcomes as an ever-present kind of issue? And I think that's a question of political organizing and political messaging and having clarity about the project that you're pursuing.
Right. And last question, and it relates to your, I think, poignant point about certain economies, like Asian economies. Considering the rate of development in Asia in particular, are there other models that are likely to be more popular in these parts of the world that could deliver similar to the Green New Deal, just transition ideas?
Yeah, I mean, that is such a good question. I think that I think one of the reasons why we have to think about combined and uneven development is that we have to acknowledge that there are certain parts of the global south that need to address ongoing issues of poverty, rural displacement, and so I think this is really one of the central questions for the just transition in the future, and I think it would be you know, how the center of global manufacturing now, which is largely occurring in Asia, can implement a just form of decarbonisation. I mean, I think this is a huge challenge, and you know, I will leave that thought to another day to think about that, because it's such a big question. I really appreciate you pushing me on that. That's a real tough one.
Well, Damien, again, as usual, you know, thanks for these expansive thoughts. They're not everyday thoughts in urban planning, but these are allied to futures that we are going to be planning in, and a lot of this is just super relevant, Damien. And I really want to push you on the book. Damien is going to write a book in my Just Sustainability's book series, aren't you, Damien? Can you?
I am, sir. I'm signing now.
Thank you. Okay, good.
Thank you.
Right, with that, can we give a warm UEP send off to Damien White?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
And thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next week for Dean Saita, who's going to be talking about intercultural urbanism. Wow. Thanks again, Damien.